For most of my life, I believed I was doing everything right. Not perfectly, but correctly. I followed the signals. Listened to advice. Paid attention to what was expected of me and adjusted accordingly. I didn't rebel. I didn't collapse. I didn't ruin anything obvious. From the outside, my life looked reasonable. Predictable. Acceptable. And that's exactly what scared me when I finally noticed it. 10 seconds into this confession, here is the truth I avoided for years: I didn't lose my life to a mistake. I lost it to a role I never questioned. I learned early who I was supposed to be. Not explicitly, no one sat me down and gave me instructions. It was quieter than that. Looks of approval. Relief when I behaved a certain way. Silence when I didn't push back. I absorbed it without realizing. Be sensible. Be stable. Be someone people don't worry about. So I became that person. I didn't ask myself whether it fit me. I assumed that fitting was the goal. Every major decision I made passed through the same filter: does this version of me make sense? Not, is this who I am? The difference felt subtle at first. It grew enormous over time. I chose paths that aligned with the image. I said no to things that felt risky or uncertain, even when they pulled at something deep inside me. I postponed questions that didn't have practical answers. I told myself I was being mature. What I was really doing was narrowing. I didn't notice the narrowing at first. That's the danger of doing what's expected: it rarely hurts immediately. It feels safe. Supported. Validated. People praised me for being grounded. Responsible. Consistent. I internalized those words as identity. I became the version of myself others were comfortable with. Slowly, without drama, another version faded into the background. The one that felt too much. The one that wanted things without justification. The one that didn't fit neatly into timelines or plans. I told myself that version would come back later. Later, when things were settled. Later, when I had more freedom. Later, when it made sense. Later became a habit. Years passed. Life progressed. Nothing fell apart. I built a routine that worked. I met expectations. I maintained relationships. I kept moving forward. And yet, something inside me stayed untouched. I remember the first time I felt the disconnect clearly. I was standing somewhere familiar, doing something I had done 100 times before, and suddenly it felt like I was watching myself from a distance. Like I was present, but not involved. I wasn't unhappy. I was detached. That's a harder feeling to explain, and an easier one to ignore. I told myself this was normal. That adulthood meant trading intensity for stability. That passion was for early chapters. That depth arrives quietly, later. But deep down, I knew this wasn't depth. It was absence. I started noticing how often I spoke about my life in terms of logic rather than feeling. How easily I could explain why my choices were sensible, and how difficult it was to say whether they mattered to me. When people asked if I was happy, I answered honestly, I'm fine. And that was true. Fine is a dangerous word. Fine doesn't demand change. Fine doesn't alarm anyone. Fine lets years pass without resistance. I lived a fine life for a long time. The problem is, fine slowly replaces alive if you're not paying attention. I had moments where the other version of me surfaced, brief, uncomfortable flashes. A sudden pull towards something irrational. A desire that didn't align with the plan. A feeling that didn't make sense. I dismissed them quickly. That's not me, I told myself. That's unrealistic. That's not who I am. But what I really meant was, that version of me doesn't fit the life I've already built. So I kept choosing the role. Over time, the role hardened into identity. I stopped noticing where I was performing and where I was being real. The line blurred until I assumed there was no difference. But something was happening quietly underneath. I felt tired in a way rest couldn't fix. I felt disconnected during moments that should have mattered. I watched myself succeed and felt strangely uninvolved. It was like living inside a well-lit room with no windows. Everything visible. Nothing open. The realization that changed everything didn't arrive as panic or breakdown. It arrived as a question so simple it felt harmless. If no one expected anything from me, who would I be? I didn't have an answer. That frightened me more than any crisis ever had. Because it meant that somewhere along the way, I had confused being acceptable with being myself, and let the real version disappear without a fight. And once you notice that absence, you can't unsee it. Once I asked that question, I couldn't stop hearing it. If no one expected anything from me, who would I be? It followed me through ordinary days. Through conversations where I nodded at the right moments. Through decisions that came easily because I already knew which version of myself was expected to answer. The question didn't accuse me. It waited. I tried to ignore it the same way I had ignored everything else that didn't fit. I told myself this was just another phase. A temporary dissatisfaction. Something that would pass if I focused on what I had already built. But focusing made it worse. The more I paid attention to my correct life, the more I saw how carefully constructed it was. Every choice reinforced the same identity. Every routine protected the same version of me. I realized that I wasn't just living a role, I was actively maintaining it. And maintenance takes energy. I started noticing how often I adjusted myself in real time. How quickly I edited my reactions. How instinctively I avoided saying things that didn't match the image. I wasn't lying exactly. I was filtering. Filtering became exhausting. The suppressed version of me didn't come back dramatically. It didn't demand attention. It showed up as discomfort. As a quiet restlessness that made stillness unbearable. As a sense that something essential was being ignored on purpose. I tried to approach it carefully, the way I approached everything else. I asked myself small questions. What do I actually enjoy? What do I want when no one is watching? What feels honest even if it doesn't make sense? The answers surprised me. Not because they were extreme. Because they were simple. Things I had dismissed for years as impractical. Unimportant. Too risky. Not aligned with the plan. I realized I had trained myself to distrust anything that didn't come with external validation. If it couldn't be explained, it couldn't be chosen. That realization hurt. Because it meant I hadn't been living cautiously. I had been living defensively. The fear wasn't about failure. It was about disruption. About breaking the continuity of a life that made sense to others. About becoming someone people didn't recognize, including myself. I looked at everything I had built and felt a strange loyalty to it. Not love. Loyalty. As if questioning it would be betrayal. As if the years I had invested demanded I keep going exactly as I was. That's when I understood how traps actually work. They don't look like cages. They look like achievements you're afraid to question. The internal conflict grew louder. The more I tried to explore who I might be without the role, the more guilt surfaced. Guilt for wanting something different. Guilt for feeling ungrateful. Guilt for even considering change when nothing was wrong. I had no crisis to justify myself with. That made everything harder. People understand change after disaster. After heartbreak. After collapse. But how do you explain that you want to change because you've realized you're not fully here? That you've been present, productive, praised, and absent from your own life at the same time? I began testing honesty in small, almost invisible ways. Saying what I actually thought instead of what was appropriate. Admitting uncertainty instead of projecting confidence. Allowing myself to want things without immediately explaining why. Each time felt dangerous. Each time felt relieving. I noticed how some people reacted with discomfort, even confusion. The version of me they knew had been predictable. Easy to place. This one wasn't. I also noticed something else. I felt more real during those moments than I had in years. Not happier. Real. That distinction mattered. Reality came with friction. With awkwardness. With consequences. I felt clumsy, unpracticed, like someone learning to use muscles that had been dormant for a long time. I made mistakes. I said things imperfectly. I questioned myself constantly. But underneath the doubt was a growing certainty. The version of me I had been living as was not wrong. It was incomplete. And the longer I stayed in it, the harder it would be to recover what I had buried. I stood at the edge of a realization I had spent my life avoiding. You can be admired and still be absent. You can be stable and still be lost. You can live a life that makes sense, and means nothing to you. The role I had chosen had given me safety, structure, approval. It had also quietly demanded that I stay within its limits forever. I began to see that the cost of staying was no longer just discomfort. It was erasure. I didn't know yet what choosing myself would look like. I only knew that if I didn't choose soon, the question would stop asking and start accusing. And I wasn't sure I could live with that. The moment I finally stopped living as the right version of myself didn't feel like freedom. It felt like betrayal. Not of others, of the life I had spent years building. Of the choices I had defended. Of the identity I had carefully maintained. Letting it crack felt like admitting that I had been wrong for a very long time. And that terrified me. The decisive moment wasn't dramatic. There was no announcement, no rupture, no visible rebellion. It happened quietly, during a situation where the old version of me would have responded automatically. Someone expected a familiar answer. A predictable agreement. The version of me they trusted to be consistent. I felt the words forming, the safe ones, the approved ones. And then I felt something else. A refusal. Not loud. Not angry. Just firm. I can't do this the way I used to, I said. The room didn't explode. But something fundamental shifted. I could feel it immediately, the subtle recalculation, the discomfort, the sense that I had stepped out of alignment with the image people had relied on. And suddenly, I was no longer familiar. That scared me more than rejection ever had. In the days that followed, the consequences arrived slowly. Not as punishment, but as distance. Some people didn't know how to interact with me anymore. Some relationships grew strained. Some expectations quietly dissolved. I lost something important. Certainty. I no longer knew who I was supposed to be in every situation. The role that had guided me for years was no longer available, and without it, I felt exposed and unskilled, like someone learning how to exist without a script. There were moments I regretted it deeply. Moments when the old life looked tempting again. Smooth. Predictable. Admirable. I could still return, I told myself. I hadn't burned everything. I could step back into the role and restore the balance. But something had changed. I could no longer pretend that balance hadn't been costing me myself. Choosing to be real didn't make me happier. It made me heavier. Every decision now belonged to me. There was no moral template to hide behind. No version of myself to perform for approval. When things went wrong, I couldn't blame misunderstanding or circumstance. I had chosen. And that responsibility was exhausting. But it was also grounding. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to feel present in my own life. Not in a cinematic way. Not joyfully. Just, here. My reactions felt connected to my inner world instead of filtered through expectation. My words carried risk, and that risk made them matter. Some people left. That loss hurt in a way I hadn't expected. I had believed they cared about me. I realized they cared about the version of me that made things easy. Letting that truth settle was painful, but clarifying. Others stayed. Those relationships changed. Became messier. More honest. Less comfortable. But they no longer required me to disappear to function. I learned something important during that time. The right version of yourself is often the one that survives best in the eyes of others. The real version is the one that survives inside you. For years, I had confused approval with meaning. Stability with depth. Being needed with being known. I had lived as a concept instead of a person. Letting go of that concept felt like losing a life. In a way, it was. But it also gave me access to something I had never had before. Agency. I no longer ask if my choices make sense to everyone else. I ask if they align with me, even when that alignment costs me comfort, admiration, or certainty. I don't live louder now. I live truer. And truth, I've learned, doesn't announce itself with happiness. It arrives with friction, responsibility, and the quiet relief of no longer pretending. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, living as the version that makes sense, the version that's acceptable, the version that never causes concern, I won't tell you to abandon it recklessly. I'll tell you this. That version of you exists for a reason. It kept you safe. It helped you survive. But survival is not the same as living. And if you never allow yourself to meet the version underneath, the one without the role, without the script, without the approval, you may one day realize that you lived a full life, without ever being fully there. I lived as the person I was supposed to be for a long time. Now, finally, I'm learning how to live as the person I actually am. And even though it's harder, it's the first time my life feels like it belongs to me.